The Data Editors pane is where users can add a new pathway or modify an existing pathway. There are over 1,000 pathways in Greet.net, so chances are good that if you're modeling a product related to transportation, a pathway already exists for you to use or modify in Greet.net. In this video, we'll review the layout of the Data Editors pane, and then we'll edit a pathway. Data Editors is where pathways can be created or modified, and we'll first review the layout of this pane. Along the top is a menu of features that can be viewed, added, or modified. The features are Resources, Technologies, Processes, Pathways, Pathway Mixes, Modes, Vehicles, and Emissions. When the pane is first opened, there's a list at the bottom of how many of each feature there are available in the model, and there's also a list of the most recent modifications made by the Greet development team. Now let's look at a pathway by clicking on Pathways in the pane menu, and we'll select Modify Pathway. We'll use the example of pet coke from crude for use in U.S. refineries. Now that a pathway diagram is displayed, the Data Editors pane looks a little bit different. Most of the pane is comprised of a pathway display frame, much like that on the WTP pane. But we also see additional sections at the left and at the bottom. In the upper left, we see a list of compatible processes. This is a list that contains processes that have the same inputs and outputs that are in the processes of our pathway. So these compatible processes can be connected to a process in our pathway. Below the compatible processes, we see a list of compatible pathway outputs. And these are products that happen to be an output for a process in the pathway, so that we can drag in the compatible output, and we can connect that to an output in a process if we wanted to add that compatible output into the pathway. In the lower left of the pane, we see a product menu with pathways and mixes, just like the menu shown on the WTP pane. We can drag a process into the diagram, but the process can only be connected to a pathway if it has a compatible input or output to connect to an existing input or output. At the bottom of the pane, we can see the name of the pathway. There's a section for notes, which sometimes contains information about the pathway. And users can also add notes here as well. And finally, there are two buttons in the bottom right. You can click Add as New if you have created a new pathway or modified one such that you'd like to add it as a unique pathway. And if you just want to modify an existing pathway, you can click Apply. Now let's try replacing processes in a pathway. We'll stick with the pet coke pathway, but first let's navigate to the WTP pane, and we'll copy results and paste them in an Excel spreadsheet so we can compare them to results for the pathway that we edit later on. Now we'll go back to the Data Editors pane, and the first thing we'll do is delete the process called pet coke production from crude for use in U.S. refineries. And we'll replace that process with one called pet coke production from oil sand. Then what we'll need to do is reconnect the output of the new process, which is petcoke, to the input of the next process, which is a transportation process for petcoke. We do that by selecting the connector tool and then dragging a line between the two processes. A quick side note, you don't have to match the output amount of one process to the input amount of the next process. As long as they're the same resource, Greet will calculate the correct amounts according to the final pathway output. Now notice that there are two inputs for the new production process that uses oil sands, and both are crude oil. The previous process that used crude instead of oil sands had an input for crude as well as an input for gasoline blend stock. This means that the upstream pathway called heavy butane from crude oil, crude recovery for U.S. refineries, is no longer needed. We can leave that pathway process as is, or we can go ahead and delete it. Either way, we'll have to connect the crude oil output of an upstream mix to the crude oil inputs of the petcoke production process. The current upstream mix process, which is called crude recovery for U.S. refineries, outputs a crude oil average used in the U.S. So let's switch that out for a process called crude from oil sands by surface mining. Then we'll connect the output with the inputs. This ensures that upstream impacts are coming from oil sands and not from a default U.S. crude mix. If we click Apply, a pop-up window explains that other pathways, processes, etc. will be affected by the changes made in our petcoke pathway. So we can click OK to acknowledge that. And at the very bottom of the model program window, there are now two messages in red font. The first is project has been modified. And that's a prompt for a user to save a modified project. And once that save is made, the message will disappear. The second message is a prompt to recalculate the model. And to do that, we can hit the F9 key, or we can go to the main menu, click Results, and select Calculate. Another quick side note, if modifying a pathway that is open in the WTP pane, which is the situation we have now, we'll have to recalculate, or the changes won't carry through to the results or the pathway diagram in the WTP pane. So we'll first navigate to the WTP pane and calculate, and once we do that, we can see that the results and the pathway diagram have changed to reflect the edits we made in data editors. And now that we've recalculated, we will copy results into Excel, and we can compare with the original results we pasted in a few minutes ago. We can see that emissions have increased, and resource inputs have also increased due to the changes that we made to the pathway. Now, when editing a pathway, you may want to select Add as New and create a new pathway instead of applying changes to the existing pathway, because it may be difficult to restore that pathway without closing the model before you save your changes, and then your changes will be lost. If you go ahead and add a new pathway, just be sure to rename the edited pathway, or you won't be able to save it. Now that I've demonstrated how to edit a pathway, you can practice the same steps on your own. The steps being adding, deleting, or replacing a process, reconnecting inputs and outputs, applying changes or adding a new pathway, and recalculating. Good luck, and as always, thanks for watching.